She left me nothing. That was all the lawyer said before closing the file in front of me. No explanation. No hesitation. Just that, a final sentence to end a lifetime of silence. I remember the smell of his office that day, polished wood, stale coffee, and the faint sweetness of old paper. The kind of smell that made you feel like decisions here couldn't be undone. The air felt too still, too heavy. I could hear the second hand on the wall clock tick behind me, marking each moment I sat frozen in disbelief. My aunt, Eleanor, had been gone for just 5 days. I hadn't cried yet. I thought I would, after all, she was my only living relative on my mother's side. But instead, I just sat there, dry-eyed and trembling, as the lawyer slid the thin will across the table. She left the estate to her caregiver, he added softly, as if that softened the blow. Her caregiver. A woman named Sophie, whom I had never met. I felt something sharp rise in my chest, not quite anger, not yet grief, but something in between. A hollow ache that felt like being forgotten. When I left the office, the winter wind slapped my face so hard it stung. The sky was gray, almost bruised. I stood on the steps, holding that envelope like it could still change if I wished hard enough. I didn't even open it. I already knew the truth. Aunt Eleanor had left me nothing. And yet, deep down, I also knew there had to be a reason. Because if there was one thing my aunt wasn't, it was cruel. Before everything fell apart, Aunt Eleanor had been the quiet constant in my chaotic life. She wasn't affectionate, not in the way my mother was before she passed. But she was steady, the kind of person who would send a birthday card a week early, with handwriting that looked like pressed flowers. When I was a little girl, she'd braid my hair so tight I'd get headaches, but I never complained. She'd hum while she did it, old hymns, never the radio. "You'll thank me one day," she used to say, tying the ribbon with precision. Things worth having should be kept neat. That was Aunt Eleanor in a sentence, everything in its place, feelings included. When I turned 18, we had a falling out. Or maybe it wasn't a fall, more like a quiet drifting. She disapproved of the man I married, Daniel, and she didn't hide it. "He smiles with his mouth, not his eyes," she told me once, right before our wedding. I laughed it off back then. I wish I hadn't. After that, she stopped calling. Every letter I sent went unanswered. Every holiday came and went without her voice on the other end of the line. 20 years passed that way. 20 years of silence, until the call came saying she had died in her sleep. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had forgiven me. I thought maybe, in her will, she'd leave something behind, not money, but acknowledgement. A letter. A trinket. Something to say she still thought of me. But all she left me was emptiness. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the unopened envelope. The refrigerator hummed softly. The kettle whistled even though I hadn't turned it on yet. Daniel was asleep upstairs, or pretending to be. We hadn't spoken much in months. I tore the envelope open, finally. The legal jargon blurred together, but the words "no bequest" stood out like a wound. There was no personal note, no mention of me. Just lines and signatures, cold, final, irreversible. That's when I noticed something strange. In the attachments, there was a supplemental letter from Aunt Eleanor to her executor. It wasn't addressed to me, but it mentioned me, by name. Under no circumstances my niece, Lila, to inherit the estate at 14 Juniper Lane. She forfeited that right the day she made her choice. I stared at those words for a long time. The day she made her choice. What choice? Leaving home? Marrying Daniel? It didn't make sense. But what made even less sense was Sophie, the woman who now owned everything my aunt had worked her whole life for. The next morning, I called the lawyer again. "Can you tell me who Sophie is?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "I'm afraid I can't disclose much," he replied, voice clipped. "She was your aunt's live-in caregiver for the last 5 years. Beyond that, privacy laws." "I'm her only blood relative," I interrupted. "Surely." "I'm sorry, Ms. Wells. That's all I can tell you. He hung up before I could say another word. That was when I decided I couldn't just let it go. If Aunt Eleanor truly wanted to disinherit me, I needed to understand why. So I drove. Juniper Lane was 3 hours away, tucked in a sleepy town where every house looked older than its owners. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. When I turned onto her street, memories flooded in, summers spent picking blackberries in her garden, her sharp voice scolding me for eating them before washing, her perfume that smelled faintly of lilac and soap. Her house still looked the same, white shutters, ivy crawling up the porch, lace curtains in the front window. But there was a car parked outside now. A small, pale blue hatchback. I knocked. The door opened slowly. And there she was, Sophie. Mid-30s, maybe younger. Pale skin, hair tied in a loose bun, eyes that seemed to recognize me before I even introduced myself. "Oh," she said softly. "You must be Lila." My name on her lips felt wrong, too familiar. "Yes," I replied. "And you must be Sophie." She nodded, her smile polite but guarded. "I'm sorry for your loss. She spoke about you sometimes." "Did she?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Because apparently, she didn't think much of me in her will. Sophie's expression flickered, guilt, maybe. Or something close to it. "She had her reasons," she said quietly. "It wasn't simple." Her words echoed in my head long after I left that night. It wasn't simple. I didn't know it yet, but that visit was only the beginning. Because behind the calm voice and the soft smile, Sophie was hiding something that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my aunt, my family, and even myself. When I got back home from Juniper Lane, the house felt smaller somehow. Quieter. Daniel was still in his usual spot, reclined on the couch, beer half finished, watching reruns of some show he didn't even like. He muted the TV when I walked in, eyes flicking toward the keys in my hand. "So," he asked, not even pretending to sound supportive. "Did you get your big inheritance?" I dropped the keys into the bowl near the door. They made a sound louder than I intended, sharp and metallic, like punctuation to an argument we hadn't started yet. "She left me nothing," I said. He gave a dry chuckle, the kind that wasn't really laughter. "Well, can't say I'm surprised. You barely spoke to her for what, 20 years? The words stung, not because they weren't true, but because he said them like a weapon. "That's not the point," I snapped. "She mentioned me in the will, said I'd forfeited my right." "What does that even mean?" Daniel shrugged, eyes drifting back toward the muted TV. "Maybe she didn't like your choice of husband," he said, smirking. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't respond. Not then. Arguing with Daniel had become like scratching an old scar, it only reopened things that would never heal. Instead, I went upstairs, closed the door to my office, and opened the small box I'd kept tucked under the desk for years, my Aunt Eleanor box. Inside were old letters, faded photographs, and a silver locket she'd given me on my 16th birthday. I lifted the locket carefully. Inside, a tiny photograph of my mother, smiling, sunlight in her hair, and on the other side, the words etched in Eleanor's neat cursive. "Family is what you protect, not what you prove." I'd never really understood that line before. But that night, it felt heavier than ever. Before the estrangement, Aunt Eleanor had been the most structured person I knew. She lived by rules, not ones written anywhere, but ones she believed in with the fervor of a creed. Rule 1, always keep your promises. Rule 2, never owe anyone money or mercy. Rule 3, never let emotions cloud judgment. She used to say those things like she was handing me survival tools, not advice. And maybe, back then, I didn't appreciate her way of loving. Because Eleanor's love wasn't soft or verbal, it was practical. She didn't hug you, but she'd fix your tire at midnight. She didn't say she missed you, but she'd send you a sweater every winter, wrapped in tissue paper, with a note, "Stay warm." Winters can be cruel. After my mother died, Eleanor was all I had left. I was 20, lost, and freshly married to Daniel. I still remember the last time I saw her, standing in her doorway with that same lace curtain behind her. She'd looked at Daniel once, then at me, and said, "If you go through with this, Lila, don't come back to me when the smile fades." I told her she was being dramatic. She said, "I'm being honest." We didn't speak again. In the following years, my life became quieter, not better, not worse, just routine. Daniel worked construction jobs that came and went. I worked part-time at a local library. We never had children, partly by choice, partly because the topic always ended in tension. We lived in a small house with beige walls and a yard Daniel swore he'd fix every spring but never did. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about Aunt Eleanor, wondering if she still kept her garden, if she still made that lemon tea she used to drink every morning, if she ever forgave me. And every Christmas, I'd wrap a small box, a candle, or a book, and send it to her anyway, even though I knew she wouldn't reply. Each time, the package came back stamped, "Return to sender." Still, I kept sending them. It made me feel like I was holding on to something, even if it was only my own guilt. The week after the will reading, I couldn't shake the image of Sophie's face. Something about her didn't sit right, not her words, not her composure, not the way she looked at me like she knew something I didn't. I told myself to let it go. But I couldn't. So I began to look into her. It started small, a Google search. Nothing much came up. No social media, no background details, just a few mentions in local directories as a private caregiver. Then I found a photo, a blurry one, of her at a local charity event. She was standing beside Aunt Eleanor, who looked frail but smiling. Sophie's hand was on her shoulder, protective. Protective or possessive? I couldn't tell which. "Why are you looking her up?" Daniel asked one evening when he walked in on me at the computer. "Because something doesn't add up," I said. My aunt never trusted people easily. She wouldn't leave everything she owned to someone she barely knew. He sighed and rubbed his temple. "Maybe that woman actually cared for her, Lila. People change when they're dying." I turned toward him slowly. "You think I'm just bitter?" He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, a little. His honesty cut deeper than I expected. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, the ceiling fan humming above me, staring at the faint crack on the plaster, the one Daniel kept promising to fix. I kept thinking about the phrase in the letter, the day she made her choice. What choice? To marry Daniel? To leave? Or something else, something I didn't even remember? At 2 a.m., I finally gave in. I got up, slipped on a sweater, and drove back to Juniper Lane. The house was dark when I arrived. But a light glowed in the kitchen window, warm and golden, like a memory refusing to fade. I parked at the edge of the drive and sat there for a while, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart thudding in my chest. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, a clue, a letter, a reason. But as I stared at that window, something in me shifted. I wasn't there for money anymore. I just needed to understand why she'd erased me. And as I would soon learn, the truth about Aunt Eleanor's inheritance had very little to do with money. It had to do with what she'd been protecting all along. The second time I saw Sophie, she didn't look surprised to see me, more like she had expected I'd come back. She opened the door slowly, wrapped in a cream cardigan, hair unpinned this time. Behind her, the house smelled exactly as I remembered, lavender polish, old wood, and that faint trace of lemon tea. "Lila," she said quietly. "It's late." "I know," I replied. "I just needed to see the house again. Please. Just for a few minutes." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "All right. But don't touch anything in the study, it's still being sorted." The study. That was Aunt Eleanor's private world, the one I wasn't allowed to enter even as a child. I nodded, pretending not to care, though every nerve in me was pulled toward it. The house felt like a time capsule. The same oil lamp on the hallway table. The same grandfather clock that chimed too loudly every hour. Even the wallpaper, pale green with tiny roses, hadn't changed. But the photos were different. Where once there had been framed pictures of my mother and me, now there were none. In their place were landscapes, pressed flowers, and, here and there, photographs of Sophie with my aunt. One of them caught my attention. It was taken in the garden, Aunt Eleanor seated on the bench, Sophie kneeling beside her, both smiling faintly at the camera. My aunt's hand was on Sophie's. Not just resting, clasped, almost affectionate. It was an intimacy I'd never seen her show anyone. "She looks happy," I said softly, half to myself. Sophie stood beside me, following my gaze. She was happier than she'd been in a long time. Something in her tone made me turn. "She told you that?" "She didn't have to," Sophie replied. "You can tell when someone finally lets go of bitterness." Bitterness. The word hit me like a slap. "I didn't mean to be a source of that," I murmured. "I know," she said. "But sometimes, forgiveness comes too late to matter." Her words lingered in the silence that followed, quiet but cutting. I found myself wandering to the kitchen. The tiles had been regrouted, but the same chipped teapot sat on the counter. I remembered how Aunt Eleanor used to pour from it every morning, her hand steady, movements precise. "She used to hum while the kettle boiled," I said without thinking. Sophie smiled faintly. "She still did. Right up to the end." The image softened something in me. "She kept that habit," I whispered. "I used to think she hummed just to fill the silence." "She did," Sophie said simply. After a while, Sophie offered me tea. We sat across from each other in the same dining room where I'd eaten countless Sunday lunches as a girl. The light above us flickered slightly, old wiring, probably. "She kept everything," I said, looking around. It's like she was waiting for time to stop. Sophie stirred her tea gently. "She wasn't waiting. She was guarding." "Guarding what?" Sophie didn't answer right away. She looked toward the hallway, toward the closed door of the study. Finally, she said, "You should ask yourself what she was protecting you from." The words unsettled me. Protecting me? From what? That night, I couldn't get the house out of my mind. I lay awake, the smell of lavender still clinging to my clothes, her words looping in my head. What she was protecting you from. It sounded absurd. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. Why would Aunt Eleanor go to such lengths to disinherit me, yet still mention me by name? Why destroy every photo of us, yet keep her letters? Unless she wasn't angry, she was afraid. The next morning, I called the lawyer again. This time, I was firmer. "I need to know if my aunt left any private correspondence," I said. "Letters, recordings, journals, anything." He paused, then sighed. "There were sealed boxes. Per her instructions, they were transferred to the new owner, Miss Sophie Quinn." "Then she has them?" "Yes. I'm sorry, but legally they're her property now." My grip tightened around the phone. "Can you at least tell me how many boxes?" "3, he said. "All marked personal archive. Your aunt was very specific, they weren't to be opened by anyone else." That was the moment I knew Sophie was hiding something. The next time I visited, I planned to ask about those boxes. But before that, I needed to prepare, to understand my aunt not as I remembered her, but as she became in those final years. So I went to the library, my workplace, and pulled the local archives. There she was, Eleanor Grace Hargrove, former teacher, retired principal of St. Mary's Academy. Respected, private, well-liked. And then something else, a small newspaper clipping from 5 years ago. Local widow found after 3 days missing. Residents of Juniper Lane report that Eleanor Hargrove, 72, was found disoriented but unharmed after disappearing from her home earlier this week. Authorities confirm no foul play was suspected. Missing? I had never heard about that. The article went on. Ms. Hargrove was reportedly cared for by a private nurse during recovery. The name wasn't mentioned, but I didn't need to guess. Sophie. That evening, I drove back again, this time with a purpose. When Sophie opened the door, her smile faltered slightly. "Back again?" she asked. "I won't stay long," I said. "I just want to ask you something." She nodded slowly. "Go on." 5 years ago, I began, my aunt went missing for 3 days. You were her caregiver then, weren't you? Her hand tightened around the edge of the door. Where did you hear that? It's public record. She looked away for a moment, then back at me. That was before I started full-time with her. I met her after that. She was fragile, needed help. I was recommended through a friend. Something in her tone was too rehearsed, too careful. Why did she choose you? I asked. Her expression softened again, almost wistful. Because I reminded her of someone she loved once. Later, as I drove away, the sunset bleeding across the windshield, I couldn't shake her words. Someone she loved once. Who was that? My mother? My father? Someone else entirely? The question gnawed at me all the way home. And then, while sorting through my aunt's old letters again, I noticed something I hadn't before, a name scribbled faintly in the corner of one envelope, next to a half-erased return address. S. Quinn. My heart stopped. That letter had been sent almost 15 years ago. Long before Aunt Eleanor ever hired a caregiver. For the rest of that night, I sat on the living room floor surrounded by letters, dozens of them, most unopened, some brittle with age. The envelope with S. Quinn on the corner lay on top, as if it had been waiting for me all along. My hands trembled as I opened it. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting unmistakably my aunt's, neat, deliberate strokes that never faltered. But the letter wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to someone named Sarah Quinn. Sarah, I wish you'd told me the truth before I found out the hard way. I won't interfere again, but you should know, she deserves to know who you are. If you ever change your mind, my door will always be open. There was no date, no return message. Just that. And suddenly, everything inside me went still. Sarah Quinn. Sophie Quinn. The connection was impossible to ignore. I checked the postmark, 2008. Sophie would have been in her late teens then. Old enough to be Sarah's daughter. My pulse quickened. Could it be? I couldn't sleep. Not even close. By morning, I was back in my car, the letter folded neatly in my coat pocket, the kind of truth burning a hole through fabric. When I reached Juniper Lane, the air was gray again, the kind of morning where everything looked faded, even the light. Sophie opened the door before I could knock. She must have seen me coming. Lila, she said softly, almost resigned. I was wondering when you'd come back. You knew I would, I said. Her eyes didn't waver. Yes. Because Eleanor knew you wouldn't stop until you found out. I held up the letter. Who was Sarah Quinn? She didn't flinch, but something flickered in her expression, grief, guilt, maybe both. She was my mother, she said quietly. The words hit me like cold water. Your mother, I repeated. Yes. I stared at her, struggling to piece it together. Then, how did she know my aunt? Sophie hesitated, then turned toward the hallway. Come in. This isn't something I can explain at the door. We sat in the study, that forbidden room I had never been allowed to enter. It was smaller than I remembered, lined with shelves of old books and boxes stacked neatly against the wall. On the desk sat the teapot, a pair of reading glasses, and an unfinished letter written in my aunt's perfect penmanship. Sophie poured tea for both of us before she began. My mother, Sarah, worked here years ago, she said. Not as a caregiver, as a teacher's assistant. Eleanor was her supervisor. I frowned. That must have been before I was even born. It was, she said. They became close. My mother looked up to her. Said she'd never met anyone so disciplined, so sure of right and wrong. There was a pause, the kind that told me the story was about to turn. But something happened, I said softly. Sophie nodded. Yes. My mother made a mistake. She fell in love with a married man, one of the parents at the school. It turned into a scandal, and she lost her job. Eleanor was furious. She told my mother she'd ruined her life, and mine. She said she couldn't protect us both. I listened, heart thudding. She left, Sophie continued. We moved away. My mother struggled after that, different jobs, different towns. She died when I was 22. I only found the old letters from Eleanor years later, after she was gone. She looked up at me then. That's when I wrote to her. I didn't know if she'd reply. But she did. My throat tightened. And she took you in? She said she owed my mother a chance at redemption, through me. I swallowed hard. So, she left everything to you because she felt guilty? Sophie's eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, pain, maybe shame. No. Not guilt. Because she thought you'd be better off not knowing. I frowned. Not knowing what? Sophie hesitated, then reached for one of the boxes stacked behind the desk. She pulled it open gently, revealing rows of letters bound with twine, and a small stack of photographs. She handed me one. It was of my mother, and Sarah Quinn. They were young, smiling, sitting together on a park bench. My stomach dropped. What is this? I whispered. Sophie's voice was quiet, careful. Your mother and mine were friends. Close friends. But there was more, something they never told you. I looked at her sharply. What do you mean? She took a deep breath. Lila, my mother was your mother's sister. I froze. That's impossible, I said. My mother only had one sibling, Eleanor. She had two, Sophie replied. Your grandmother gave Sarah up for adoption when she was a baby. Eleanor found out as an adult, and she kept it secret all her life. My mother didn't even know until much later. The room swayed. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking, louder and louder, each second a hammer against my chest. So you're telling me, I began slowly, that you're my cousin? Sophie nodded. Yes. I stood up, unable to sit still, every part of me shaking. She hid this from me? I said, voice trembling. She knew I had family, blood, and she never told me? She thought she was protecting you, Sophie said softly. She believed you'd resent your mother if you found out she'd kept secrets too. She didn't want the past repeating itself. I turned on her. Protecting me? By erasing me from her life? By leaving everything to a stranger? I wasn't a stranger to her, Sophie said, her voice cracking. I was the only one she could forgive. The words cut through me like glass. Forgive? I whispered. For what? For not being you, Sophie said quietly. She couldn't forgive herself for losing you, so she forgave me instead. I didn't remember leaving. One moment I was standing there, the next I was outside, cold air stinging my face. The letter still clutched in my hand, my aunt's handwriting trembling against my skin. It felt like my whole history had been rewritten in one afternoon. Everything I thought I knew about family, about loyalty, inheritance, love, had been twisted into something unrecognizable. Aunt Eleanor hadn't left me nothing out of hate. She had left me nothing because she thought she'd already given me too much: safety, distance, ignorance. But all I could feel in that moment was betrayal. Because the truth didn't heal me. It hollowed me out. When I got home that night, Daniel was waiting in the kitchen. Where have you been? He demanded. Learning who my family really is, I said. He stared at me blankly, like I was speaking another language. But for once, I didn't bother explaining. Because some truths aren't meant to be shared, they're meant to be carried. And mine was heavy. I didn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, Aunt Eleanor's calm, unshakable expression, the way her voice used to drop when she said my name, Lila. Some things are better left untouched. I used to think she meant the family silver. Now I knew she meant the truth. The letter from Sarah Quinn lay open on the table beside my coffee mug. Every line of it looked like a wound. I had read it so many times the paper had begun to tear where my fingers gripped it. I tried to picture it all: my grandmother's decision, the secret sister, Eleanor's guilt, Sophie's existence, but the pieces wouldn't fit neatly together. They refused to behave like a story I could accept. Because what kind of family builds a life on silence? Daniel tried to help, in the way husbands do when they don't know where to begin. "So what now?" he asked one morning, leaning against the counter. "Are you going to contest the will?" I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that startled even me. "Contest what? The house, the jewelry, the money?" He shrugged helplessly. I shook my head. "It's not about that anymore. It's about why." Daniel studied me, his expression softening. "Maybe she thought Sophie needed it more." "Maybe," I said quietly. "Or maybe she couldn't bear to face me again." He reached for my hand. "You could still talk to her, to Sophie. Try to understand her side." I wanted to tell him I already had. But understanding someone doesn't always mean forgiving them. By the third night, I found myself driving again. The road to Juniper Lane was slick with rain, headlights stretching across the asphalt like broken glass. Sophie's house glowed faintly through the mist, that same amber light in the window. I almost turned back. But something in me refused to leave things unfinished. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. "I figured you might come back," she said softly. "I just need to ask one thing," I said, stepping inside. She nodded, waiting. "Why didn't she tell me?" Sophie took a long breath. "Because she promised your mother she wouldn't." I blinked. "My mother?" "Yes." She gestured toward the desk again. "There's something else you should see." She pulled out another box, smaller this time, tied with pale ribbon. Inside was a stack of envelopes, all addressed to Eleanor. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. The first letter was dated 12 years ago, around the time my mother passed away. "Ellie, please don't tell her. She's finally stable, happy. I don't want her to live with my mistakes. Promise me you'll keep it quiet. If she ever needs family, she has you." My mother's words blurred as I read them. All those years I'd blamed Aunt Eleanor for being distant, for never saying "I love you," for being the cold wall between me and warmth. She had been keeping a promise. She hadn't been shutting me out. She'd been shielding me. And in doing so, she'd carried the burden alone. Sophie watched me with quiet sympathy. "She didn't want you to see her as the villain," she said. "She said you already lost one mother, she didn't want to take another away from you." I nodded slowly, the ache in my chest pulsing like a heartbeat. "So she chose you," I said finally. "She didn't choose me over you," Sophie said. "She chose to make peace with what she couldn't fix. And maybe, she thought we'd find each other when the time was right." I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't the thief I had imagined. She wasn't the cold stranger who'd stolen my inheritance. She was family. One I'd never known I had. And for the first time, that realization didn't sting. It just felt sad. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Sophie walked me to the porch. Before I could step off, she said quietly, "There's something in the envelope she left for you. I think she wanted you to decide when you were ready." I frowned. "What envelope?" She disappeared inside and returned a moment later with a small, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. My name, Lila, was written across it in Aunt Eleanor's handwriting. My throat tightened. "Thank you," I whispered. When I got back to my car, I sat for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page, folded neatly. "My dear Lila. You've always believed that love and truth should live in the same room. I once believed that too. But life teaches us that sometimes, to protect love, we must bury the truth beneath it. I made choices you will not understand, perhaps you never should. But if you're reading this, it means you've found the door I left open for you. Walk through it kindly. The past is yours now. Do with it what I could not. Eleanor. I don't know how long I sat there after that, minutes, hours maybe. The words felt like a benediction and a confession all at once. I finally understood that inheritance wasn't always a thing you could spend or hold. Sometimes, it was a truth someone left behind, trusting you to bear it without breaking. A week later, I went back to the house, our house. Sophie met me at the door, nervous, unsure. I smiled faintly. I think Aunt Eleanor wanted this place to belong to both of us. Sophie blinked, stunned. You mean? Yes, I said. We'll figure it out together. Maybe it's time we stop letting her secrets keep us apart. Her expression softened, a tear slipping down her cheek. She would have liked that. I looked around at the walls, the paintings, the old ticking clock. For the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like peace. That night, I stood in the garden, the one Aunt Eleanor had tended so fiercely. The wind carried the faint scent of lavender and earth. I whispered, "You can rest now." And for the first time in a long while, I meant it. The house on Juniper Lane is quieter now. The kind of quiet that doesn't sting anymore, it just breathes. It's been 6 months since that night in the rain, when Sophie handed me Aunt Eleanor's letter and my world rearranged itself once again. In that time, we've both learned how to live with the ghosts that linger in the corners, not as intruders, but as reminders. I visit every weekend now. The garden is alive again, stubborn little wildflowers pushing up through the soil, the way Aunt Eleanor used to like them. Sophie kneels by the rose bushes, her hair tied back, gloves caked with dirt. She looks up at me sometimes and smiles, that small, uncertain kind of smile that says, "We're trying." We don't talk much about the inheritance anymore. Not about wills, or property, or who deserved what. Instead, we talk about ordinary things, how the light falls differently in the morning, the sound of rain on the porch roof, the old recipes we find scribbled in the margins of Eleanor's cookbooks. It's strange how peace creeps in, not in grand gestures, but in small, unannounced moments. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of Aunt Eleanor's things, I found an old photograph I'd never seen before. It was black and white, 2 young girls, standing side by side in front of a lake. One of them was unmistakably my mother. The other was Sophie's mother. Both of them smiling, their faces turned toward the same light. On the back, in Eleanor's handwriting, were the words, "Before it all went wrong." I stared at it for a long time, my fingers tracing the faded edges. So much of our story had been written in shadows, secrets passed down like heirlooms. But here, finally, was proof that before the silence, there had been love. And that mattered more than anything. Sophie and I decided to keep the house just as it was. The furniture, the creaking floors, even the chipped teapot on the stove, all of it stayed. We called it Eleanor's Rest. Sometimes we host small family dinners there, my husband, our kids, Sophie's friends. We fill the rooms with laughter, with stories, with music. I like to think Aunt Eleanor would have stood in the doorway, her hands folded, pretending not to listen, but smiling, all the same. Forgiveness didn't come quickly. There were nights I still felt angry, at her, at my mother, even at myself for needing answers so badly. But each time I walked through that front gate, the anger loosened its hold a little more. Because I realized that holding on to pain doesn't preserve love, it distorts it. And somewhere between the grief and the truth, I found something better than inheritance. I found understanding. One evening, as Sophie and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, she asked quietly, "Do you ever wish she'd done things differently?" I thought for a moment before answering. "I used to," I admitted. "But now I think, maybe she did the best she could with what she knew. Maybe love isn't about being perfect. Maybe it's about trying to protect someone, even if it means they'll hate you for it." Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "She loved you," she whispered. "I know," I said. "In her own way, she did." The next morning, I visited the cemetery. The grass was damp, and the air smelled like early rain. I laid fresh lavender on her grave, the same kind she used to plant behind the kitchen window. For a long time I didn't say anything. Just stood there, listening to the wind moving through the trees. Then, softly, I said, "You left me nothing, and somehow, you gave me everything." It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't grief. It was gratitude, gentle, quiet, full. Because she had given me something I hadn't known I needed. The truth. And a sister. Now, when I tell people the story of my aunt, the one who left me nothing, I tell it differently. I don't talk about the will or the money or the house. I talk about the woman who carried a lifetime of guilt on her shoulders, and the 2 daughters she tried to love in silence. I tell them that sometimes, what looks like betrayal is just love that took the wrong shape. And that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about finally seeing what was there all along. The last time I locked up the house for the evening, I turned back to look at the porch one more time. The wind had picked up again, and for a second, I could almost hear her voice in it, low, calm, amused. "Take care of it, Lila." "I will," I whispered. Then I smiled, locked the door, and walked toward the car as the light faded behind me.